There's so many games that you'll think about when you hear them sounds and you see those logos appear. The PlayStation was a system that birthed so many iconic game franchises and characters, a ton of which are still crazy popular to this day. But for me, there's always one set of games that I think back to more than any of them, gripping me from the start with their unique storyline, art style and game mechanics. A collection of survival horror experiences that as a kid terrified me, but also engrossed me so much that I couldn't turn them off no matter how many times I told myself that I wanted to. I was fully captivated, and I wasn't the only one, because still to this day, it remains the game developer Capcom's most popular selling franchise of all time, with an IP that spawned multiple sequels and movies and merchandise releases, but more importantly for this video, it's a brand that back in 1998 teamed up with Toy Biz to create a line of action figures that were not only the first of their kind, but in my opinion, also the last of their kind. And it's called
Resident Evil.
Now before we get fully into talking about this toy line, I think it's important to take ourselves all the way back to the era that they were created. It was the late 90s, everyone's little sister had a Furby, Schwarzenegger was Mr. Freeze, the NWO had taken over WCW and the Spice Girls had taken over the world. It was a simpler time, an incredible time to be growing up and an even better time if you was a gamer. So it's 1998, I've just got my first ever PlayStation console, and I asked my mom if we could go out and get a PlayStation magazine so I could see what games were available for it. And after a quick trip to the shop, I came home with this one, this exact one, PlayStation Pro April Edition, with the first UK exclusive review of a brand new horror game called Resident Evil 2. Resident Evil 2? What the fuck is that? That sounds gnarly, I remember thinking. Who's this dead rotting zombie woman? Why is this crow eating a severed hand? I was freaked out, but also fully intrigued, and over the next few weeks I would obsess over the photos in this thing, finding out about Res 1 and Res 2 as we used to call them, and legit scaring myself. So much so that even after I got my PlayStation chipped and my dad's friend could get me any game that I wanted for just £5, I still never dare ask him for a Resident Evil game. And instead I would get Pandemonium, or Tekken 2, or Lone Soldier, or something else light-hearted that wouldn't have me up all night shitting myself. I was only 10 years old, remember? Then one afternoon when I was chilling at my friend's house, his parents told me that that evening they were going to be playing the new Resident Evil 2 game, and if I wanted to watch them go through it. Boy was I conflicted. Fuck yes, I wanted to watch and play Resident Evil, and the fact that I didn't have to actually play it myself was even more appealing because I definitely was not ready for that shit. But knowing that I was gonna have to walk home that night when it was dark through a bunch of already raggo generals and council estates made me really want to decline the offer. But no, it was time to face my fears. Time to become a man. Time to finally enter Raccoon City for the first time ever and play some Resident Evil.
Don't shoot!
Get down!
As you can probably tell, I thought it was fucking incredible. It was everything that I wanted it to be and more, and from that evening on, Resident Evil 2 became one of my favourite games of all time. So you can also imagine how excited I was when I heard that Resident Evil was now not only just a game, but they'd also released a line of action figures to coincide with it. I remember one of my friends at school telling me that he'd seen them for sale in a shop in town, and I couldn't stop thinking about them. It was actually the first time that I remember getting that proper toy hunt bug that you get when you're a collector, and obviously, I made it my mission to try and track them all down. Now it wasn't easy, and it definitely took me a while. In fact, it took me like 20 plus years all in all, but eventually I did get all of them. So after that long and lengthy intro, we can now finally get into looking at the toy line, starting off with Wave 1, who are all actually characters and creatures from the first game in the series. These figures were also sold in double packs for the most part, so we'll be looking at them in sets of 2. And I thought it'd be fitting to kick things off by looking at this pair, Chris Redfield and the Cerberus. Not only because Chris is by far one of the most iconic characters in the franchise, but also because the Cerberus zombie dogs are the first creature that the STARS team encounter when they arrive at the Spencer Mansion at the start of the very first game. Chris Redfield is everything that you would want from a Toy Biz action figure. He's got great articulation, his outfit is literally identical to his game counterpart. He's also got a little bit of an anime look to his face, which is pretty fitting because Resident Evil was a Japanese-made game after all, and most of the early promotional art did very much follow in that style, which is probably what the sculptors worked from a lot when they were creating these things. In terms of his weapon loadout, he's got his iconic upside-down combat knife on his chest, a nice chunky magnum revolver, and then whatever the fuck this thing is, which looks like a mix between a flamethrower with the fuel canister underneath and a projectile-firing missile launcher. Now, most of these figures all have an action feature as well. Chris's is a little trigger on his back that has him reacting to sudden movements when you pull down on it. So only a subtle bit of movement, but nice enough all the same. And if you was a collector in the late 90s looking to add a Chris Redfield figure to your collection and you picked this up, I really don't think you'd be disappointed. The Cerberus is also a very faithful adaptation of the source material. I love how he's got one of his ears ripped off and maggots wriggling through his ribcage. Also in the game, a lot of the time you knew when one of these were going to burst out at you, because the PlayStation would pause for a second and do a little load. And even though you had a second to anticipate their arrival, it still always definitely put you on your toes a lot more when one of these things turned up. Like most of the other toys in the series as well, the Cerberus has its own unique action feature, where it can be blown to pieces by shooting it with a projectile. This is also, to my mind, off the top of my head at least, the only exploding Doberman action figure that's ever been released ever. The Jill Valentine and Web Spinner Toxic Tarantula double pack is one that I've got very fond memories of playing with as a kid. They nailed the look and the colour scheme of the giant spider perfectly, and a lot like Chris, Jill was a very accurate representation of her original promotional art. Her outfit is pretty much identical to what she rocks in the game. She's got great articulation, which also pairs nicely with the exact same aim and shoot trigger action that Chris has got. And although she doesn't come with a sidearm, she does still get her own version of one of these giant kitbash what the fuck cannons. A projectile firing rocket launcher that looks a lot more like a grenade launcher and shoots some kind of incendiary rounds. Whatever it is, it seems like the perfect weapon for burning giant poisonous tarantulas off the walls, especially when they're trying to fire their slimy streams of tiny toxic babies at your head. Interestingly as well, both the guns that Jill and Chris are photographed with on the back of the packaging are quite different to what we ended up with in the final releases, so I'm not sure when they decided to change them, but they definitely don't look like the ones that they were originally planned to come with. Jill and Chris were the only two heroes that we got in Series 1. All the other sets were made up of creatures and enemies. We got the Tearaway Limbs Zombie and Zombie Forest Speyer, the Hunter and the Chimera double pack, and finally the Tyrant, which was the only figure in this first wave to be sold on his own and with no accessories, but he's twice the size of all the others, so it kinda makes sense to have him packaged up solo. All these figures again had various action features. The lab coat maggot zombie could be pulled apart and dismembered. The zombie version of Bravo team member Forrest came with a stand that lets him spring to life like Frankenstein when you pull this little lever at the front, which is actually a pretty good portrayal of how he resurrects when you have to fight him in the game. The Hunter and the Chimera double pack is one that I never actually had as a kid. This is a set that I only acquired recently, so out of all of the figures that I've got here today, these are the ones that I don't have any nostalgic attachment to. The figures at least. My memories of these creatures were facing them in the game, especially the Hunters. When these guys turned up in Resident Evil 1, all bets were off. They were even worse in the remake. They were fast as fuck, moved rapid, were very difficult to put down, soaked up ammunition, and if they got hold of you and you didn't have a survival knife or a grenade, you was as good as fucking worm food. In terms of the sculpts on both these toys, they're awesome. The Hunter's got this shredded chest with veins all over it. He's also got a chunk of flesh hanging off one of his claws, almost looking like he's ripped out someone's fucking adrenal gland. The Chimera is as disgusting as you'd expect, crouching in this little squatting position as if he's about to pounce on you and swipe you with one of his hook claws. And in terms of authentic video game actions, we've got a Hunter slash attack and an exploding head feature for the Chimera. The final figure of Wave 1 and the final character from the first Resident Evil in the Toy Biz series is the Tyrant. This is the big boss that you face at the very end of the game, and although there were lots of different tyrants that featured in games after this one, this guy right here is the OG Tyrant, the original. Standing at 8 inches tall, he's way bigger than any of the other figures in this first wave, and he's definitely, without doubt, a very fine representation of how he appears in the finale of the game. Now, back when this guy was first released in 1998, liquid blood would pump around his exposed heart when you press this button on his back. But this thing's like 30 years old now, so it's long since dried up. It does take nothing away from the figure though, and his swiping super attack action still works perfectly. Series 2 would see the end of characters from the first game in the toy line. From here on in, it would be all Resident Evil 2 characters and creatures that would be featured. Now, most of the toys in this first series I did have as a kid, but I didn't buy them brand new or from a shop or anything like that. I actually got most of them from my friend Slacky as a job lot when we were in secondary school. So the figures that we're going to be looking at next are the ones that I've got the most memories with, because they were the ones that I literally went and bought off the shop shelves. Now, I must have been like 11 years old at this point, and I remember it like it was yesterday. I jumped in the car with my dad straight after I'd finished school, and we headed over to this shop that apparently sold Resident Evil figures. And I came home with the Claire Redfield and Zombie Cop double pack. These were not only the first Resident Evil figures that I would ever own, but they were also the first ones that I ever saw with my own eyes in person. Up until this point, I just heard people talk about them on the playground and imagine what they look like. So being able to go out to a shop and see that they actually existed was the best thing ever. I remember looking at this zombie, like sitting on my bed and actually studying it, examining how gross it was. The same bed that I would then throw it under at night because it freaked me out so much and I didn't like looking at it before I went to sleep. No shit, I genuinely used to get weirded out by this thing. That's the sign of a very good toy design right there. He's got this horrible snarling mouth with yellow teeth, and his cheeks have rotted away so his tongue hangs out the side of his jaw. One of his eyes is missing, and the one that's left has this morbid little beady pupil inside. He's riddled with bullet holes, 3 of his fingers have been ripped off his left hand, and then in his right hand he's clutching onto some kind of donut. Funny that this cop was such a fan of Krispy Kremes that he didn't let go of this one even whilst he was having his intestines disemboweled. Speaking of his intestines, if you press them inside his stomach, his body also explodes, because why not, right? And you could also peel back his hat to reveal his little rotting brain inside. Overall, I think this is the best zombie in the entire toy line. The sculpt on it is fantastic, the paint application works perfectly, there's so many little fine details on him that help give him a bit of a story, and the fact that this guy made me feel so much back then, when I was a kid, and still buzzes me out to this day, in my mind makes it a real standout piece. So now let's talk about Claire Redfield. I feel by this point in the line, they'd kind of stopped with the anime look to the human characters and tried to model them a lot more on the CGI rendered models that were used to promote the game when it came out. She's got the iconic upside down Redfield knife on her chest, but it's not removable like her brother's was in the first series. The outfit is a perfect adaptation of her game attire though, even if they did have to adjust the logo on the back of it to make way for her action lever. In terms of firearms, she's got this old 6-shooter and also a projectile firing bolt gun, which is the crossbow that you pick up at the start of the game if you go back into the gun shop after the zombies have torn the owner to pieces. So it's a real nice addition to the toy for her to have this, even if it is way oversized, but we have established with the guns in the first wave that that's the route that they were going with these. So I really don't have a problem with it. These things are action figures with play features after all, so I get it. There is something that I don't like about this figure though. And honestly, I never like to critique other people's work and say negative things about sculpts and other creatives' design decisions, but the pose on this toy and the lack of articulation in the arms are something that I've just never been able to get along with personally. It's something that I do think ruins both the hero characters in this wave, and I'll touch on it a little bit more when I get to the Leon figure. But the way that she stands, with her left arm locked like that at the elbow with that clenched fist, and then her other arm being permanently outstretched in this trigger finger position, for me just isn't the vibe. I can forgive the fact that her hips are also slightly tilted to one side, because the Chris figure in Wave 1 was like that. And although I did think it was a little bit noticeable, it didn't stand out to me too much. I also get that it works with her aim and shoot action, kind of, but Chris and Jill both had that action and their arms weren't fixed in that way. So because of this, I always found this design choice here on Claire a little bit disappointing. A couple of weeks later, I got the rest of the figures from this wave for my birthday. I remember being so excited to open them up, the first one being this guy, who's not only another one of those boss figures that's so big that he was sold on his own and not in a double pack, but he's also got a transforming feature. So throughout the game, William Birkin, who is the main antagonist in Resident Evil 2, injects himself with one of the mutant viruses that creates all these creatures and monsters in the stories. From that moment on, he slowly starts to mutate and change, and every time you see him, he looks a little bit different. This version of him is what we see towards the end of the game, like part of the final main boss battle. And by this point, you've been fighting him on and off throughout most of the story. But just when you think you've killed him and you can finally escape the city, he gets up and transforms into this guy, his final form. To do this is really simple. You just hunch him over, bring these arms round to the front, switch his heads up and attach his big teeth mouth. And I know this is a really simple transformation, but it really works, and as a kid this feature gave the figure a ton more playability, especially when you wanted to reenact them final scenes from the game. Now, as you know, we do have Claire, but no Res 2 boss battle reenactment would be complete without the other half of the game's heroic duo. The rookie cop, fully thrown into the deep end on his first day of joining the Raccoon City Police Department, and one of my favourite characters in the entire Resident Evil series, this guy, Leon S. Kennedy. Now, as a kid, I thought Leon was the fucking guy. He had the 90s curtains, the fingerless gloves, the dope navy blue SWAT-looking tactical armor, and even before I'd seen any gameplay of him, and I'd just read about his character in the PlayStation magazine, I thought everything about him looked and sounded awesome. So obviously, I was very eager to get an action figure of him. That excitement, though, did definitely wilter a bit when I finally got one of these in hand. It was definitely one of them where I'd built it up in my head, but then upon actually receiving it, I was even more disappointed with this figure than I was with the Claire one. Now, just to clarify, I'm not hating on either of these figures. They both hold a very special place in my heart and always will. They were two of my favourite toys to play with as a kid. But as I mentioned with the Claire figure, it's just the poses that they put these figures in. And this one that Leon is cursed with truly needs to be spoken about. So the first thing that I remember thinking is that he did look a bit young. I was only a kid at the time myself, but even I thought he looked baby-faced. Leon is supposed to be in his early 20s. Yeah, this guy looks like my Danny Manigan action figure from Last Action Hero. And I mean, that's whatever. I didn't hate it or anything, it was just very noticeable to me at the time. As I mentioned before though, the pose that this thing's in is terrible. It was terrible then and it's terrible now. Basically, his left leg hinges forwards like thousands of other action figures do, that's fine. But for some reason, his right leg sticks out sideways, to a point that it doesn't even look like he's standing up properly, and I've no idea why. I know most of these figures have a little action feature, and I talked before about how Claire has limited arm articulation, but these legs on Leon are way worse. I remember wanting to get a toy police car and modify it into an RPD patrol vehicle for him, but there'd be no point because he wouldn't be able to sit in the thing anyway. And you could argue that it's because they wanted to put him in a pose so he looks like he's leaning forward and shooting, but that doesn't work either. His foot is completely turned sideways and his other foot is facing forward. And just to add icing on the cake, he's also been sculpted in a way that he's slightly hunched over, which means that he's shorter than Claire, but at the same time has a bigger head than she does, making him look even more of a weird man-child than he already did. It really is a shame as well because the outfit that he's wearing is awesome. It's exactly like the gear that he wears in the game, and the artillery that he came with was also bang on. No oversized Kenner Terminator cannon with this dude. Instead, Leon comes with a perfectly scaled pump-action shotgun and his Matilda pistol with the modded stock, just like the one that you get in Resident Evil 2. Now, the creature that Leon comes with in his double pack is not only one of the coolest creatures in the game, but also, in my opinion, the whole toy line, the Licker. One of the most iconic creatures in all of Resident Evil. I remember when you first see this thing crawl across the window when you walk past it in the police station corridor, and then you find a corpse of a man that it's killed with no head, and the description, it seems to have been twisted off. So fucking ominous, I love it. Dope creature design too, and this thing is a fine adaptation of it. The ink wash that they've used for its exposed muscle looks wet and bloody, and if you wind up his tongue and press this bone spine in its back, it twists and spins for some classic Licker action. Making up Wave 3 and the final figures in the Toy Biz Resident Evil toy line were again all characters and creatures from the second game in the series. In terms of heroes, this wave concentrated on more of the side characters, and the creatures were probably some of the best designed and engineered in the whole line. We've got Ada Wong and the Ivy Poisonous Plant Monster, a transforming Mr. X, an earlier version of William Birkin with his daughter Sherry, and a Zombie and Hunk double pack. Ada, who is a special agent that turns up in Leon's scenario of the game, is everything that you could want from a toy version of her character. She doesn't have any action features like the others, but she also doesn't suffer from any weird posing issues either. Weirdly, she's also got a watch painted on her wrist. I'm not sure why. Maybe they forgot to sculpt her one and then realised in post that they needed her to have one in order for it to be game accurate, so they just painted her one instead. She's also got a cloth dress for some reason, but it's not too big or bulky or anything like that. It fits on her pretty good, so it doesn't look out of place. In terms of weaponry, she does just come with one single pistol, but that's all she uses in the game. She is, however, packed in other areas, something that we definitely used to laugh about as kids. Ada might have forgot to sculpt her watch, but you gotta love how everything else about her is very accurate to her game equivalent. The ivy plant that comes with Ada is also fantastic. And I said this about the liquor, but I think this might actually be my favourite toy in the whole line. You see, while most of the other figures actually look like a toy that you would play with, this one looks a lot more like something you would see nowadays from NECA. It's a great size, it's very chunky, has a lot of weight to it, its arms have wire inside so you can bend them around and pose them in different positions, and its mouth is also rigged with puppet strings so you can animate it by pressing this button on its back. Now, over the years of me collecting these toys and buying them, I have picked up a couple of doubles here and there. So I do have two of these now, and as you can see, this one's mouth has warped from being pressed up against the bubble on the card. Just another example of how toys can deteriorate and become warped over time, especially when they're made from rubber. So I'll be making sure that I take extra special care of these ones moving forward. But with me having two, I don't actually mind this one's face, because when you're standing them both together, they can look like they've both got slightly different expressions going on. And when you fight these things in the game, they often rock up in pairs of two. So having a couple of them looks great for these kind of displays and setups and photo shoots. For the record as well, the ivy plant from Resident Evil, in my opinion, is one of their coolest creature designs. I always loved the concept art for them as well. It was a shame that when they did the Resident Evil 2 remake a couple of years ago that they left these guys out and replaced them with just infected zombie creatures, which were cool, but they were no ivy. It's actually my only gripe with that entire game, because other than that, it's pretty fucking perfect. Then we've got Dr. Death himself, the Grim Reaper, the fourth survivor, the human unit never killed, Hunk, another one of those fan favourite characters and an absolute badass that's known throughout the lore of Resident Evil as the ultimate zombie killing machine. I was actually really surprised when I was a kid when I saw that they'd made a figure of this guy, because Hunk is not one of the main people in the game, and he's also only playable if you complete the game several times in a very specific order, and even then it's only a speedrun minigame that you unlock him in. But because he's such a mysterious character and rocks that gas mask and has such a dope look, he's always one that people love, me included. I even dressed up as this guy for Halloween before, that's how much I love me some Hunk. In terms of the figure, there's not that much to say about it, other than he's a repaint of the Chris figure with a different head and body armour. He also comes with the same revolver that Chris does, but in a darker plastic, and this awesome full-length riot shotgun. The zombie that he comes with is also a recast of the lab coat zombie from the first wave, only this time with a different head, and a head that looks a lot like the first ever zombie that you encounter in the first Resident Evil game, which is a nice nod. This pack also comes with a crow, which is another iconic creature that's in pretty much all of the Resident Evil games. These things are a bit top heavy though, so trying to get them to stand up and look cool does require an additional bit of blue tack. At the same time though, these things are a real nice little extra that they didn't have to add into the packs, and makes me really appreciate the fact that they did. This also goes for the entire pack as a whole, because although the Hunk and the zombie are both just mostly repaints of figures from Wave 1, the fact that we was able to get a figure of Hunk and the first ever zombie that we see in the first game was just awesome in itself. Also added points for giving the zombie a checkered shirt, pure Dawn of the Dead vibes. Then we've got Mr. X, who is a boss character that appears in the second scenario, who starts off looking like this, with a long black leather jacket, boots and fingerless gloves, only to later transform into his own version of the Tyrant, with giant slashing claws, and this weird organic armour growing around his head and his shoulders. This was another figure with a transforming feature, and to say that in the game, this guy's face is very much just a bunch of random pixels and polygons, the way that it's been sculpted here to have that blank expression, but still look like the Mr. X that follows you around the police station is an absolute triumph in my opinion, and it's exactly what you would want from a Mr. X figure. Also, like Ada, this is another figure with a cloth element to its clothing. Unfortunately, over the years, mine has suffered a little bit of wear, and I don't think it's down to the fact that it's been played with a lot, because this has pretty much just been stored on a card, and more down to the material that it's been made from. Also, fun fact, this toy was the first time that this character was ever referred to as Mr. X. Before this release, he was only ever known as just another tyrant, which is cool because this guy is now known as Mr. X throughout the entire world of Resident Evil. Okay, last set. Now, I know that I said this about the liquor and the ivy plant, but I think the William Birkin in this box might actually be my favourite toy in this entire series. Before we get to him though, we'll talk about the Sherry Birkin figure. There's not much to say about her other than she looks exactly like she needs to. She doesn't have any action features, but I'm not sure what action features she would need, and she's perfect if you wanted the full roster of characters to reenact the story from the game. She's also very fittingly paired with her dad, or at least the creature that was once her dad, William Birkin, who we have already featured in Series 2, but this is an earlier version of his mutation development. And honestly, one that I think's way cooler because this is something that's straight out of John Carpenter's The Thing. Now, when I got this toy as a kid, honestly, I'd never seen a figure like it. There was so much going on. Tons of exposed muscle and bones and eyeballs with spikes growing out of him. I love how you can see the start of his extra arms growing out of his side, and the smushed face of what was once William Birkin sloped down after being now replaced by his new monster head. He's got one shoe with his toes sticking out of the front for some Playmates mutant vibes. And he's even got this weird bit of cloth attached to his left arm, a little bit of what remains of his lab coat, and also something to switch up the textures a bit. He's got this big claw arm with a little lever in the back of it that you can use to move his eyeball around, which is exactly like it does in the game, and just another fantastic little element to a very well made and incredibly well sculpted action figure. Now, at the start of this video, I mentioned that these figures, in my opinion, were not only the first of their kind, but very much the last of their kind, and I want to elaborate a little bit on what I meant by that. Like I also said at the start, it's important for us to understand the era when these figures were made, because up until that point, there'd not really been any other toys like them. We had kids' toys and action figures based on mature and R-rated movies, but other than the odd Mortal Kombat figures, never really for a game franchise. Nowadays, you can pretty much get an action figure for any mature game, but they would also mostly be figures that were marketed to collectors and adults that buy toys, not kids, and not to be played with the same way that kids would. So that in itself is pretty unique. And the reason I say this is simply because all of the action features, which to me is something that puts them in a weird zone that's not quite a kid's toy because the Resident Evil figures and those games are for a mature audience, but also because of those action features and the firing missiles etc, they obviously weren't exclusively marketed to adult collectors either. And it would also be around this time that companies who marketed their stuff more to adults would stop making toys with action features, and everything would move more towards the movie maniacs direction of figures that were bought to pretty much just be displayed. When you think of modern McFarlane toys and NECA and stuff that you can buy now, they're mainly designed to be displayed on a shelf. Maybe posed for photo shoots with interchangeable hands and heads and weapons and stuff, but they're not made to be thrown around and played with action features like these Toy Biz figures were. So for me, these toys do really exist in a weird little time period of toy manufacturing that we really have never seen again since. Now, I could do a whole deep dive on this and get really in depth with it, and maybe that's something that we can save for a future video, but for now, I just wanted you to understand why I feel the way I do about this line, and why I think these figures really are something unique and special. When I look back at these toys, I don't just see figures that I remember playing with as a kid. I see me in the car with my dad driving to town to try and hunt them down in Forbidden Planet. I see me sat with my friends playing the games, doing full weekends and all-nighters, passing the pad, trying to defeat bosses and work out puzzles, looking through game guides and magazines if we got stuck, walking into rooms and hearing something, and then being so scared as we ushered forwards as the next camera angle unlocked and we could see what was there waiting for us. That relief of finding a bunch of green herbs and ammunition, only to then realise that it's probably because we're about to go up against something that's really big and hard to kill. All these memories will always hold a real special place in my heart, and I've said it before, but when you've spent so much time in a certain location, like the Spencer Mansion or the Raccoon City Police Station, they literally become as familiar to you as the street that you grew up on because you've spent so much time exploring them.
Resident Evil 3.
Now, around the time of Resident Evil 3 Nemesis being released, I got very ill with a medical condition called nephrotic syndrome, where every day I would wake up to sharp stabbing pains in my kidneys. My face would swell up, my body would bloat, almost looking like something from Raccoon City, and because the doctors didn't immediately know what it was, I was left wrongly diagnosed for almost 2 years. When they did finally get to the bottom of it, it was so close to being fatal that I was rushed into hospital and had to stay there for 2 weeks. Now, it was very shit, I was really young, but also just a bit too old to be able to have my mum stay with me, so I had to spend all of the evenings and the nights alone. They were allowed, however, to bring my PlayStation into the hospital, so even though at night I was in this big hospital wing all on my own and it was really lonely and pretty scary, I still had my PlayStation games to help keep me distracted, and of course I was playing Resident Evil 3. So now, when I see Jill Valentine, I don't just see a character in a game, I see my fucking homegirl that helped me power through one of the most painful and traumatic experiences of my entire childhood. Resident Evil is just one of the many franchises that I love that was just there for me at a time when I needed it, and maybe on a level you can relate. Maybe not to Resident Evil specifically, but to a film or a toy line or a game that in a similar way has looked after you when you needed that distraction. So I've got great memories of first playing those games and collecting and playing with these toys, and that's the reason why I wanted to do this whole video on them today, because I really felt like they deserved to be showcased, both for people that grew up with them and to other people that might have never seen them before. I didn't want to go on a big historical deep dive of the franchise and talk about all the stuff that came out after, because they're still making Resident Evil games, films and merchandise today. I just wanted to speak about my personal experience of a particular era when Resident Evil was one of the coolest things that I'd ever seen.
We'll meet back here in exactly 14 hours.
Are you? I can hear you. Oh my god! Get off me! What the hell is this? It's some sort of puzzle. Stop! Oh my god. What is happening here? I'm gonna kill all of those son of a bitch zombies one by one! Oh, thank God the helicopter's here. Quick, climb onto the rope.
I also feel very lucky to have been able to grow up in a time when the PlayStation was such a new and exciting console, and everything about it was so fresh, and we was all constantly discovering new IPs and characters that would go on to become classics. Like I said at the beginning of this video, so many of us will have our own personal favourites and memories of games that we remember playing with our friends and characters that we went on journeys with. But for me, my personal favourite, and the game that I'll forever think of when I first hear that old console boot up, will always be Resident Evil. If you enjoyed this video today, then please don't forget to give it a like, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel. As you can probably tell, I spent a long time making this episode, and I'm going to be releasing a making of video in the near future, so make sure you also stay tuned for that. I'd also love to know your thoughts on anything that we touched on in this documentary, so please feel free to chop it up down below in the comments. And I also want to say a massive thank you to all the supporters over on Patreon that helped make this video possible. If you want to get involved in helping support projects like this in the future, you can head over to patreon.com/SlimeHouseTV. I've also got an Amazon wish list that helps me buy things when I'm doing the more crafty stuff like the background dioramas that were featured in this documentary. And overall, I just really hope that you've enjoyed this documentary today, because I had a lot of fun making it, and I can't wait to make more stuff like this in the future. So until that next time, I'm Theo Kane, this is Slimehouse TV, and I'm gone. Pow.